A weary farmer had reached his limit with an overactive little pup that wouldn't stop yapping. The farmer, out of frustration, discarded the puppy onto a rural roadway. As a motorcycle group came across this heartbreaking scene, they couldn't guess the incredible turn of events about to transpire. Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. An aging, rusty pickup truck vibrated alarmingly, coming to a halt under the scorching summer heat that blanketed the remote countryside road. Seated at the wheel was Frank, a farmer aged by years of toiling under Oklahoma's sun. Exhaling heavily, Frank stated, "It's time for you to get off, little guy." In the shaky cargo bed behind the truck, a miniature black pup was animatedly jumping around, restrained by a short leash. The lively puppy's high-spirited yaps echoed in the air. However, Frank found the persistent noise grating as he went about his chores. His grandchildren presented him with the energetic pup when they came over from the city a couple of weeks prior. They didn't realize Frank would perceive the puppy's ceaseless vigor and loud yelps as bothersome rather than endearing. Grumbling to himself, Frank turned and maneuvered the truck aside on the lone road, pushing the brake abruptly. "This blasted hound just won't stay quiet," he muttered, swinging the truck's door open and trod toward the rear. The tiny pup was cheerfully prancing around on the truck's bed, tail waving vigorously, oblivious to Frank's festering anger. Bending down, Frank seized the wriggling pup from the vehicle's bed without any hesitation or warning. He carried it to the roadside, ignoring the piteous look in its naive eyes. With a hostile grunt, the elderly man flung the defenseless puppy into the air as far as his strength would allow. As it was propelled through the air, the little dog whimpered in fear before crash landing onto the road some distance away. Frank returned to his truck without looking back, any semblance of guilt suppressed by his hard-hearted nature. When the loud engine revved back to life and moved down the road, the puppy appeared stunned but unscathed. It looked bewildered and devastated, started trotting down the road, attempting to keep up with the disappearing truck. After about a quarter of an hour, the pup started to meander wearily under the intense, draining heat of the day. At that moment, the strong roar of motors shattered the oppressive quietness, heralding the arrival of a group of motorcyclists barreling around a bend further up the road. Leaning at an almost horizontal position, their studded leather attire and motorcycle chains thrashed wildly as they navigated the curve at a high speed on worn tires. Dakota was the head of the crew of motorcyclists known as the Lost Riders. He was a large, ruggedly built man with an extensive beard and mustache. As he commanded his motorcycle, his facial hair furiously flailed from the brisk wind. Behind his lenses, Dakota wore a look of severe focus. Unexpectedly on the path ahead, a diminutive, bewildered black puppy was aimlessly wandering. The riders didn't take notice of the puppy until the closing seconds. Recognizing the imminent danger, Dakota reacted promptly, veering his bike to steer clear of the animal. Dakota just narrowly escaped running over the defenseless young canine as he hastily halted his motorcycle. His massive motorcycle screeched piercingly as the rear tire left a hefty black smear on the asphalt before skidding to a halt. The accompanying motorcyclists lined up closely behind Dakota. Their motorcycles roared loudly as they glimpsed the terrified puppy crouched in the center of their path. One cyclist yelled over the deafening engines, "What's that?" Dakota answered in a low, gruff voice, "Appears to be a puppy." He silenced his motorcycle and dismounted. He lumbered towards the trembling puppy to examine it closely. His approach uncovered telltale signs of maltreatment on the young dog. It was gaunt, its fur clotted, and it appeared parched in the blazing summer heat. Another rider, a burly man named Roscoe, known for a concealed soft spot for defenseless creatures, also alighted from his bike. He cautiously moved towards the frightened animal, stretching out his huge hand. "Come here, little one," Roscoe softly coaxed. Contrary to everyone's expectations, the tiny black puppy timidly walked towards him. It nuzzled its dry, tiny nose into Roscoe's gritty palm and gave him a grateful lick. Dakota let out a coarse sigh and frowned slightly, observing the evolving scene. "This defenseless creature had a rough time," he muttered. His intense gaze swept the rest of the lost riders, his jaw tightening. "We can't just abandon it here, destined for dehydration and heat stroke." Roscoe spoke out while tenderly scratching the puppy's fluffy head. "That wouldn't be right, Chief. It's just a newborn." "I didn't suggest we would abandon it," replied Dakota. He crouched on the road and tenderly inspected the malnourished little canine. He could see its tiny ribs and protruding hip bones. "Not while I'm here." "Any person who harms a tiny, defenseless creature in such a way will have to deal with me personally," he stated shadowily. "So, what's the plan, dog?" Another biker quizzed, the sound of his running engine echoing anxiousness. An eerie smile drew itself mysteriously across Dakota's weather-aged visage, direct and unsettling. "First, we'll ensure this puppy gets to a safe place where necessities like food, water, and required medical treatment are accessible. Then," he paused, a glint of determination twirling in his steel-grey eyes as his jaw clasped rigid. "Then we determine who it was that thought they could abandon this poor pup and pay them a courteous visit, the Lost Rider's way." This resulted in a round of vivacious cheers from the other bikers, fists pounding on their motorcycle tanks and engines revved in solidarity. Once again, the Lost Riders troop set out in unison, their engines thundering into the day. Swiftly, they identified the closest animal clinic to ensure that the pup got the attention it needed. Having been thoroughly examined, fed, hydrated, and treated for dehydration, they began hunting for a safe, temporary home for the puppy. However, the Lost Riders couldn't exactly forget the wicked individual who had cruelly discarded the helpless creature on the side of the road. Several futile attempts in locating the offender had Dakota and his companions growing increasingly disgruntled. They redoubled their vigor, leaning increasingly into their informer web woven in the small towns, extracting information from shady characters. They made a concerted effort to express their willingness to go to the brink of what was possible to track down the individual responsible for such a heinous act. As the news of this clandestine manhunt spread swiftly, the county dwelt in anticipation to see if the Lost Riders would maintain their declared retribution. The county began to gossip, and conjecture started to circulate over the impending punishment that could await the mystery protagonist of this story. Just when it seemed as if all leads had dried up, a gas station worker tipped off a name. This individual was Frank Muckler, a notoriously curmudgeon legatee of a dilapidated farm located just beyond the county's perimeter. The worker recalled an incident a few weeks ago when Frank had pulled up at the gas station with a tiny black puppy barking cheerfully from the back of his pickup truck. The worker had crossed paths with the old farmer again just the day before and had inquired about the puppy. That's when Frank, grinning sinisterly, confessed to his deeds when faced with the question about the puppy's whereabouts. The offending phrase, "That bothersome pup?" "Sure enough, I disposed of that noisy furball," he admitted proudly. After Frank let out a gruff chuckle, he eagerly confessed, "I just couldn't handle its relentless barking anymore. A few weeks ago, I took it for a small trip to the deserted country road and simply abandoned the poor creature on the roadside. Brought some tranquility into my life finally." The server was so horrified by Frank's casual indifference towards mistreating the innocent puppy that he couldn't hold his tongue when Dakota's crew began asking about potential leads. He quickly revealed all he knew, eager to help track down the animal offender. When Dakota learned this, a stern smile appeared on his face. They had Frank's name and his address. The revelation made the confrontation feel highly rewarding. This was the lead they had been waiting for. Dakota instructed his men to get ready. They were going to pay a visit to Frank. After keeping an eye on the property over several consecutive days, Dakota and his team confidently affirmed that the irritable old man was the careless previous owner they were looking for. A ruthless individual whose pitiful conduct only intensified their revulsion. "That's it for me," Dakota growled, his fists tightening with anger as he signaled disgust at the obscene scene. This man is devoid of any worthy traits. He needs a lesson he won't ever forget. Under the cover of night, in a spree of clear sky, the lost riders executed their special form of retribution. They surrounded the property under the cover of darkness, securing the surroundings to maintain their stealth. Then, armed with cans of spray paint, they performed their act. When they were done, the entire property seemed as if it had been vandalized by an awful entity. A vast portrait of menacing black graffiti and the same 4 blood-curdling words glaring at every angle in a sinister red. We know what you did. Dakota and his team vanished into the night as quietly as they had come, delighting in picturing Frank's reaction when he'd see the mess the next morning. When Frank popped out from his farmhouse at dawn, he was met with a haunting spectacle. Every surface marred with loud graffiti. The old man's eyes widened with shock and fear as he frantically looked around for the now long-departed vandals. A chill ran down his spine. He realized immediately that the lost riders had figured out what he'd done to the poor puppy a few weeks ago. It was just a matter of time until they'd come back to inflict more damage. Frank's thoughts were buzzing as he desperately tried to figure out a way to escape this calamitous circumstance. He was intensely aware of the biker's sinister reputation for harsh, unofficial retaliation. The shrewd older farmer had tackled numerous difficult scenarios during his years living rural, but this was the first time he felt entirely powerless and fearful. That's when an idea flashed in his mind. If he turned himself into the police's hands, they could shield him from the biker's vengeance. Finding himself without alternative options, Frank determined this was his only hope to keep himself alive and evade whatever harsh punishment the bikers had in store for him. Swiftly, Frank collected some of his belongings, along with his truck keys, and stealthily escaped his home, marred with graffiti, before sunrise. He drove in a state of trepidation, constantly glancing his mirrors for any hint that he was being followed until he arrived at the police station. Entering, he appeared as a man who had just exited a terrifying ordeal. The aged man repeated the complete horrifying story right there, confessing to leaving the defenseless pup by the roadside as a bungling attempt to get rid of it. He also mentioned the unknown riders dispensing threatening graffiti all over his estate, signaling they were aware of his action against the pup. The astounded officers had to accept the admission and threats seriously and instantly put Frank in custody under the accusations of animal mistreatment and abandonment. While undergoing the booking and processing procedure, Frank found himself continually rambling about the biker gang and his need to be guarded in protective custody before they executed whatever retaliatory justice they decided. The police officers could merely shake their heads at the pleas of the frightened old man about becoming a target for the infamous biker gang. Finally, Frank was detained, put in jail for 2 days, and then fined, sentenced to probation and mandatory community service for his offence of animal neglect and abandonment. Although the fines were weighty for the aging farmer, Frank hoped that, if he was fortunate, accepting blame and enduring the consequences of his actions would convince the bikers to spare him. The nameless riders kept an eye on the situation following Frank's apprehension and his confession of deserting the puppy. When they saw that he had turned himself in, accepted guilt, and was sentenced by the law, Dakota and his associates hesitantly concluded that their point had been made. The stubborn old man had learned his lesson the difficult way. While they disapproved of his harsh treatment of the helpless little dog, the stray rider's stern sense of justice was aimed at reprimanding the unapologetic individual. As Frank had accepted his offence and had undergone proper disciplinary actions, they planned to leave him undisturbed, at least for the moment. Yet, Dakota clearly communicated to his comrades that if Frank ever so much as misbehaved with another animal, they would not hesitate to confront him again. He would perpetually be under their watchful eyes for any potential misconduct. Once the little dog made a full recovery and grew stronger, Roscoe took it upon himself to officially welcome him into his life. From that point onwards, he became an unexpected yet much-loved symbol for the notorious group of riders. They travelled countless miles with the dog snugly nestled within Roscoe's aged and worn-out leather jacket as they traversed towns and explored extensive stretches of open roads. What a unique tale! An intimidating group of riders rescued an abandoned dog and ensured that the neglectful owner faced appropriate repercussions. Intriguingly, these tough riders harboured a sensitivity towards animals, don't you think? Feel free to share your views in the comments section. Did the stray riders' reaction surprise you, or did you anticipate them to possess a keen sense of justice? And remember, don't forget to like, subscribe, and prime the notification bell so that you never miss out on another remarkable story.